Hi all, welcome to the first week of interviewing, where we'll be talking about designing interview projects, thinking about the research questions, the kinds of projects that work well for interviews, and designing the kind of questions for respondents that work well for interviews. In class, we'll review this video about Arlie's book, but check it out at this URL if interested. Start at about the 4400 mark to move forward on it. When you see it, or from reading the book chapter, what is Hochschild's research question? Part of it is she's interested in what is the source of political polarization we observe in our country. People increasingly live among other people who think much the same. So, how do people think in the most conservative white enclaves in the country, given Hochschild comes from a much more diverse community in Berkeley, Oakland, California? Part of the question is why do whites in some of the poorest areas support conservative policies that often hurt their communities economically? Maybe the answer is that it's only the affluent whites in those areas who are voting. What she wanted to do was look at a wide range of the literature on the rise of the right in the US to develop various theories to test in her interviewing. But more importantly than just the statistics, she wanted to know how people felt emotionally about politics. What was driving their sense, whether it's frustration or anger or other things that are driving the polarization she was interested in. So, how did she sample her population? She wanted to go to the geographic heart of the right in the South, what she would call the Super South. What she found was that only 14% of white voters in Louisiana voted for Obama in 2012, the lowest percentage of white voters for Obama of any state. So she picked that state for her study. She used a contact in Louisiana to begin meeting people in the state. And she eventually did focus groups made up of both some liberals and conservative Tea Party advocates in that area. But she also just went to individuals, Republican women lunches to meet white professional women. She followed campaign trails of Republican candidates to see who went to those events. All in all, she accumulated 4,690 pages of transcripts from interviews with a core of 40 Tea Party members and 20 others. That's just 60 people over years of work reflecting the deep conversations she had with them over multiple visits, multiple years. One thing she did was focus the conversations on the issues of pollution, in this case of one area around Lake Charles, to see how the different folks would deal with that issue and how that one issue would reflect the broader issues she was interested in of polarization and how people might be voting against their apparent economic interests. So what was Hochschild's techniques for interviewing? She called it overcoming empathy walls, taking how you might feel, things you didn't want to hear, and being able to hear from people you might not obviously talk to on a day-to-day basis, but want to understand how they think. The goal is to avoid shoehorning new information you hear into ways you already think about the world. Try to understand somebody else from the inside, from how they see the world. You want to get at the feelings people have about politics and issues, not the headline viewpoints, not just how they vote, but bring out the emotional dimensions of the political commitments they have. So, what is interviewing? Interviewing is the qualitative research you seek to gain rich, detailed information from participants. In that way, it's different from face-to-face surveys, which is often just getting headline, yes, no, A, B, or C choices for people to make. It's hard to ask about complex topics when people only have 3 or 4 choices to reduce their viewpoints to. Not everything reduces to those kinds of multiple choice answers. And in a survey, one difference is the questioner does most of the talking, laying out the question and then giving them the options, with the respondent basically just saying A, B, C, or D. With interviews, the goal is for the participant to do most of the talking, for them to tell the stories, talk about the decisions they've made in as much detail as they're willing to give. One part where interviewing is useful is applied research, especially when you're trying to evaluate policy or any kind of program result to see did it work or didn't it. And beyond knowing whether it worked, you want to find out why it didn't work, how people who were within the policy experienced it. You get deeper explanations for what went wrong and sometimes what went right. It's often used in conjunction with more formal surveys because the surveys may give you the headlines, but the interviews can give you richer details and help you understand surprising survey results you might not otherwise understand. And also, when you have statistical studies, you often want to face the stories to attach to the statistics to remind any audience for your report of the real people behind those statistics. Now, your choice is going to be either a semi-structured or loosely structured interview. With a semi-structured interview, you're going to develop a list of questions in advance. This is what you all will be doing for the project you do. And you ask basically the same questions to all the interviewees. You may add some spontaneous follow-up questions to elicit more information, get clarification on something they said earlier, but the initial questions are all broadly similar, which gives some reliability that when you compare the results, that the differences aren't just because of the order of questions you had. Now, given that structure, if you ask enough of those interviews, you can do some quantitative analysis of the interviews. Not usually as statistically representative as a full survey, but can give you some idea on that. What ways to characterize what proportion of at least of the folks you talk to fit into one category or another. With loosely structured interviews, you have a different challenge. You're going to start with a general topic and the research question you're interested in. Get the question going with a few initial questions, but then let follow-up questions come basically driven from what the participant says, as long as it's within the realm of what you're interested in. It creates a more natural flow of conversation than a structured interview. And new topics might get introduced along the way, sometimes by the participant, sometimes by you, that you're trying to get the conversation back on track, especially if it's gone a little off topic. Now, you're going to have a whole list of topics that you're interested in, and as the interview goes forward, you might want to make sure you cover them. You can introduce them or use something a participant says to redirect back to those topics as you need to. Now, these kinds of loosely structured interviews can be especially useful in some forms of applied research, since if you don't know what went wrong with a particular policy, you want participants to lead you to what it is, and it's important often to get them to explain the problems and give you insight that you might not have any clue about what was going on. Now, what kinds of questions are worth asking in an interview? One example, you could look at, say, the challenges of working with juveniles. The questions you might have are, what's it like working with the parents? What are the emotions you experience at work in such challenging work? What are the aspects of the system that people work in that's failing to stop recidivism? Getting the details from them that they see going on. What are the examples of problems they can tell you? What are the successes of the system? How do they establish bonds with kids? What is the process that's effective or that's failed for them? Have they had experience with gangs and what is that like? What's the emotions they have when they see juveniles sentenced as adults? And so on. Getting at the emotions, getting at the decisions, getting at the process they go through is all things you can get from in-depth interviews. Now, the methodology of interviews is often different from more statistical, quantitative work. If some studies, as we've talked about, have a positivist methodology, one where you are just looking for a pure hypothesis that you either prove or disprove. Interviews, while they can have that aspect, they also are often grounded in what's called interpretivist methodology. Interpretivists aim, as this quote notes, to first and foremost understand as deeply as possible the world through someone else's eyes, to know what it feels like to walk in their shoes, and to see and understand the world as they do. Now, here's the thing. How do you think about bias? Your bias and any bias a group may bring to an interview project. For interpretivist methodology, the assumption is bias is inevitable. All research is biased in some way. The key is understanding that any bias comes from the experiences you bring to the interview, the attitudes and approaches that may affect the research. So how do you get around that? First of all, interpretives believe that you have to just be upfront about what are the biases you have, disclose them in any report you have, and then use that as a way to say, I'm going to overcome this, and try to hear from people who may have different biases. Choose samples in ways that help you understand the experiences of a few people that see the world in very different ways, that exist in different contexts. And so by understanding the world they have, you don't necessarily aim to say everybody who they live with think about the world in the exact same way, but just by understanding somebody who understands the world in very different ways from you and from many people who may read your study, that is enriching the world, giving people a greater understanding that there are different ways to think and experience the world. The key here is to get as much in-depth, rich data as you can, rather than like very specific quantitative data. And you're not necessarily getting the same information from every respondent. In fact, your goal is you're even within a community that may on one level share the same ethnicity, gender, whatever it is, but you see that there's diversity even within that group and understanding that as well. So the challenge is to create a warm and genuine relationship while doing an interview. You have to create a relationship based on trust, even if it's short-term trust that just extends to what you're trying to accomplish in this interview. The most important thing is people have to feel that you're not going to judge them for what they say. And getting that degree of trust is a challenge, but hopefully a good interviewer figures out how to build that rapport as quickly as they can. And that you're trying to understand things from their perspective. Even if you don't share their experiences, if they feel that, they'll be eager to let you know how they see the world. And in some sense, you're treating the interview as a collaborative effort, that they have something to get out of it, if only to share their view of the world and know that they're being heard. There's almost a teamwork approach where you and the person you're interviewing are producing a joint effort. This leads people who do this kind of research not to talk about people just as research respondents or subjects, but that they're research participants, that they're participating with you in the process. So, what kinds of research questions for interviewing are best? The questions should seek to understand the meaning and lived experiences of individuals. It's good for understanding the decision-making process people make, not just what they decided, but the process and the steps they took in making that decision. Whether those are the actual steps they took, it's the steps they remember taking. The one thing that's true is it's hard to study cause and effect, since you're focusing on people's perceptions of what they think, what they feel, what they think happened, which is not always reality. Examples: if you ask, why do people say they experiment with drugs? How do feminists understand gender roles in relationships? How do teachers describe change since classroom due to policy changes? You may not get what's actually happening in those relationships, what people are doing, but you get a good sense of how people are experiencing those, how they feel their lives have been changed or affected by anything that's happened in their lives. So what kind of literature review makes sense for an interview project? You really want to review both quantitative and qualitative work that's been done in the research area and that has any influence on what you may want to study. It helps you formulate questions that were unanswered in previous literature. And if there's statistical research, there may show you that there are correlations out there between variables, but not why. What's the meaning of why that correlation exists? The why of why a correlation may exist is one of the deepest things you can get out of an interview. Example: there may be evidence, and there is, that less painkillers are being prescribed for Black patients for the same ailment. Question is why? One part might be to interview doctors to find out their decision-making process. What are the steps that they take? And why might you be getting this outcome? You can also, by looking over previous research, get codes, the patterns that have existed in past research that can help you think of similar patterns that you may analyze in your own interviews later. So what are the ethics of conducting interviews? The primary responsibility is written, informed consent from interviewees. This includes telling participants generally what you're studying, who is being included in the study, the estimate of the time they'll spend, that their participation is voluntary, and that consent can be withdrawn later. Explaining any use of recording devices, the explanation that interviews are confidential, the contact info of you as the interviewer, and any information for contacting the Institutional Review Board. Every university, Lehman included, has somebody to contact at the IRB. Haven't double checked this name, but this was the person who was the IRB representative that you can give to people you interview. You should ask questions carefully when it's about illegal activity. You should ask it, but you want to make sure that people recognize that you're being careful to anonymize their identity, even to the point of not writing down their name, just giving them a code name if necessary, if you're taking notes. That way, if your notes are ever seized, it doesn't trace back to the people being interviewed. Here's another ethical issue. Don't become a therapist. If somebody expresses need for help, that's important. Point them towards people who can actually help them professionally. It's neither your job nor what you should ethically do if you don't have that training. What are some other issues to think about with interviews? Even if you find interviewees' personalities or their stories abhorrent, you should still treat them with respect. Why? First, there's the ethical issue of you invited them to the interview and you're not supposed to treat people badly in general, but it also will hurt whatever data you're getting from the interview if you act judgmental and people don't feel free to talk as themselves and truthfully. How about once you have the information? Can you portray people in a disparaging way in your write-up and analysis? If your study would have a negative effect on the people you study, or even more broadly, lower the view of the overall population you are studying, you have to think about what you're doing and are you at least being fair about it. And if the negative information stands on its own, you don't need to harp on it. You're presenting the information, you can let it stand for itself without needlessly disparaging people in an editorial way. And the thing is, it's important, however you present the information, that you give the overall context and forces that is shaping the behaviors that you see and might find problematic, but you are also in the position to explain and portray what are the social forces that may have resulted in those. That's part of your responsibility as well. So here are the rules, or at least guidelines, for your interview guide. First, all your questions should be informed by your research question, that they seek the participants' stories and reflections that demonstrate the social forces and the impacts on the people that you're talking to, the forces that interest you. Ask questions that invite extended responses, not just yes or no questions. And ask general questions early on to get the broadest stories told possible. Then ask more questions that are specific, that clarify the relationships related to your research question. And near the end, ask for the clarifying information as well as any demographic information to really help you sort of center what are the differences among the people you've talked to so you can see the patterns. This is the way to build an interview process that will give you the maximum information for what you're interested in.